Good morning. I'm Rocco Landesman, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. It is Friday the 13th, and I've been asked to introduce a panel with four of the world's foremost opera artists. What could go wrong? But Richard Gaddis is here, and he may be the one person in the opera world I actually know, so things may be okay. Richard is here, along with Carlisle Floyd, and all of us, to kick off the 2009 NEA National Opera Week, and to welcome this year's NEA Opera Honorees: Frank Corsaro, Marilyn Horne, Lotfi Mansouri, and Julius Rudel. John Adams is not able to be with us this morning, but will be here for tomorrow's ceremony and performance. I also want to thank our partners for the Opera Honors, Opera America and the Washington National Opera. Of course, everyone here knows the person who's really behind opera at the NEA, Wayne Brown, our Director of Music and Opera, who's just over there. While we're celebrating with our honorees here in DC, people are taking these next 7 days to celebrate opera all across America. From the pop-up opera performances in Chicago that will take place in Millennium Park and stations along the L, to the New York City opera performance of the national anthem at a Knicks game, to the instrument petting zoo in Houston, to free performances by the San Jose Opera. I've been talking about art works since I arrived at the NEA. It's kind of our new mantra. And this week of activities showcases how art works in all three of my meanings. Opera companies are presenting great works of art. Performances are being given that will work to transport and transform audiences. And we are highlighting the artists and arts workers who are part of our country's real economy. Arts jobs are real jobs. And a key arts job is the art critic. I'm especially pleased that we have with us a real, live, eminent critic. Especially pleased because these days, critics are too often an endangered species at our newspapers. Anne Midgette, as you all know, is the classical music critic for the Washington Post, a great writer, a great friend of opera, and our moderator for this morning's panel. So let me turn things over to Anne and the honorees. Anne, take it away.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here with such an illustrious group of honorees, and furthermore, a group who are all personally congenial, which in opera doesn't always happen. It's a real pleasure. It's also striking, I think, we're gathered here to honor these careers in opera, and yet I believe everybody on this stage has had at least 2 careers in opera, some even 3. It's a real bunch of multitaskers up here. I've been asked to give brief introductions to each person's achievements, and then we're going to have a short discussion about some of their views on opera today. Frank Corsaro, in an age when today many opera companies are prioritizing theater directors and less excited about opera directors, I think it's forgotten that one of our greatest opera directors came from the world of theater. Frank began at the Yale School of Drama and in the Actors Studio, and came to opera in 1958 when he was invited to stage Carlisle Floyd's Susanna at the New York City Opera by none other than Julius Rudel, another honoree today. Frank also directed on Broadway shows including Night of the Iguana, but ultimately returned to opera bringing a pioneering view into characters' psychologies and actions, as well as a pioneering use of the dread multimedia, including video as early, I believe, as 1970. In 34 years, he did 41 productions of the New York City Opera alone, including everything from standards like Verdi's La Traviata and Puccini's Madame Butterfly to works that at the time were not known at all, like Janacek's Macropolis Affair, the infamous video opera, and contemporary American opera in particular, like Of Mice and Men, Where the Wild Things Are. Worked at other opera houses around the world, including works at the Houston Grand Opera with another honoree, Marilyn Horne. And also, his gift for narration has moved him into other aspects of opera creation, including writing librettos for at least 2 operas, maybe more, Stephen Paulus's Heloise and Abelard, and most recently Fra Margot by Thomas Passetteri. And he's also a novelist whose book Kunma came out in 2003. And if there are others, I hope you'll tell us about them.
There's one.
There's one?
Yes, I've written a novel with my son about police activity, political activity in Baltimore around the FBI. And it's now being heralded by one producer in Hollywood who wants to do a film of it. And meanwhile, publishers are in their usual sort of, panic mode, not knowing quite how to move.
Well, alas, all the arts are a bit afraid in panic mode right now.
It's a syndrome. I call it I've forgotten. I'll think of it.
You'll think
it's some kind of syndrome. It belongs there, right?
While you're thinking, I'll briefly introduce the other awardees. In 1981, Marilyn Horne was presented with a plaque from the Rossini Foundation honoring her as the greatest Rossini singer in the world. And Ms. Horne at the time rather demurred, but did say herself, "Who am I to argue with the Italians?" I certainly wouldn't argue with the Italians. Indeed, they should know, since Marilyn Horne was a pioneering Rossini singer who brought many of his operas to the stage for the first time in our modern history, in memorable both concert productions at Carnegie Hall and in stages around the world. Marilyn Horne's operatic career has followed a trajectory leading from Hollywood, where as a very young singer she dubbed for Dorothy Dandridge and Carmen Jones, I believe, and through to the art song, which has become a huge part of her legacy through the Marilyn Horne Foundation, dedicated to providing young singers with opportunities to do art songs. But of course, the heart of the career was an opera career, marked by a striking voice, large enough to sing both the powerful works in the repertory and the coloratura fireworks of Rossini and Handel at a time when nobody was doing Rossini and Handel, and when, well, Barbara of Seville has always been performed, but Tancredi or Donna del Lago were not in the repertory at the time. It was also a career that began the old-fashioned way with contemporary music, which she did quite a bit, although not everybody started under the aegis of Igor Stravinsky, who himself conducted her in many of his 12-tone works. And then a period in Germany in one of the provincial opera houses, or not-so-provincial opera houses, learning the trade in a wide variety of roles, before meeting Joan Sutherland and Richard Bonning in 1961. I think Beatrice di Tenda was the first thing you did with them. And thus began the next stage of a career that went in the ascendant to all the houses of the world, from the Covent Garden debut as Marie in Wozzeck to pieces like The Siege of Corinth at La Scala with Beverly Sills, her Met debut in 1970 as Adalgisa to Joan Sutherland's Norma, and Rinaldo, the first Handel opera that had ever been done at the Met. Ms. Horne's ringing, firm, and wide-ranging voice has always been a real example to me of the way that a voice that goes very low can support a shining top. It goes through several octaves. And she also has embraced the use of the chest voice, which many singers are rather frightened of. I believe you once said you were going...
It's the teachers that are frightened.
It's the Well, I believe you once promised to make an album entitled Chestnuts for Chest Nuts. And her vocal expertise is illustrated by the fact that she has indeed become a phenomenally successful teacher, as well as a proponent of the art song, which, as I said, is an endangered species. Two of our honorees today are both performing artists and administrators. Lotfi Mansouri has directed around the world New York City Opera, which seems to be a bit of a theme today, and of course the Washington National Opera. But he also made his mark by leading two of the significant North American opera companies, the Canadian Opera Company in Toronto, and then the San Francisco Opera. Mansouri was born in Tehran and began his career as a student of psychology, which no doubt helped him not only in directing opera characters on stage, but certainly in dealing with them behind the scenes, particularly in the boardroom. His career as a stage director took him to Switzerland, where for 15 or 16 years, he worked in Zurich and Geneva before coming to the Canadian Opera Company. I found two dates for that, but I think it's 1976 that you started at the Canadian Opera Company. at the Canadian Opera Company, in addition to continuing the directing career, he continued his reputation for introducing audiences to new works like Berg's Lulu or Britten's Death in Venice. And in 1983, he tested out some newfangled idea that a lot of people in the opera world thought was some sort of sacrilegious innovation, which was the idea of putting words over the stage in the form of supertitles. And that opera was Elektra, and of course supertitles have now become standard practice in virtually every opera house in the world. You also brought supertitles along to San Francisco when you succeeded Terry McEwen there, and I believe they debuted at the Ring production, is that correct?
Yes.
So people could at last understand what Wagner was saying. But at San Francisco, he also began an impressive track record of producing new American operas like Dead Man Walking, Dangerous Liaisons, Streetcar Named Desire, co-production of Harvey Milk, which has been a tradition that San Francisco has carried on after you, as well as continuing to direct, which I believe you're still doing actively. Yes. And finally, Julius Rudel, last but not least. There's a tradition that to be an all-American maestro, you have to come from somewhere else. And Julius Rudel was born in Vienna, and as I remember, your first exposure to American opera was through hearing Porgy and Bess on the radio. Is that correct?
Right.
And
I thought it had a future.
prescient even then, promptly came to New York in 1938 and studied at the Mannes School of Music, and then read in the paper, I believe, that a new opera company was being formed, and marched out and got a job as a rehearsal pianist at what was going to become the New York City Opera, which within a very short, well, within 10 years, I guess, you were leading. In 1957, he assumed the direction of the New York City Opera, and he led it from 1957 to 1979, introducing a huge range of repertory, both on stage and himself conducting, that nobody was doing at the time, beginning with Turandot by Puccini, which in 1957 was not a very frequently done work. City Opera was the first to offer Verdi's Macbeth, the New York premiere of Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, or under the name Katerina Izmailova, Kurt Weill's Three-Penny Opera, and Handel's Giulio Cesare in 1966, at a time when nobody was doing Handel at all. But the significant cornerstone of Maestro Rudel's tenure was a commitment to American opera that led to 3 all-American seasons, was it 3 seasons, of only American opera. During his tenure, he commissioned 12 works and conducted 19 world premieres, which is almost an unprecedented achievement. The company's first season at Lincoln Center in 1966 focused exclusively on the 20th century, beginning with a 12-tone opera by Alberto Ginastera, obviously a real crowd pleaser, starring a young tenor named Placido Domingo, whom some of you may have heard of. And in addition, American opera meant American stage directing, and Maestro Rudel sought out stage directors from Broadway and off-Broadway, also cultivating a whole generation, several generations of American singers, Samuel Ramey, Patricia Brooks, Norman Treigle, and of course Beverly Sills, who ultimately became Maestro Rudel's successor. Maestro Rudel was also artistic director of the Buffalo Philharmonic. He's conducted at the Metropolitan Opera for decades. And he was the artistic director of the Kennedy Center, which I hadn't known at its opening, and did you commission Bernstein's Mass?
Yes, I was part of Mrs. Kennedy, actually, and I decided that she wanted it. And the idea was great, so there we went.
Yeah. A work which has, of course, been revived considerably this year and has a new recording out now, and is being appreciated perhaps as it was not at the time of its premiere. And earlier this month, you took part in the gala reopening of City Opera under a new administration, which seems very much committed to following in your footsteps. There are many questions, and so many of your careers overlap here, that I could address to several of you, but I would start with Ms. Horne. When you brought Handel to the Met for the first time with Rinaldo, I believe you had a considerable say in the casting of that. And you chose Frank Corsaro, with whom you'd already worked on that opera.
Right.
What was the genesis of that collaboration, and what effect does a good stage director have on performance, specifically with regard to that Rinaldo, but also in a larger way?
Well, a good stage director, it can really guide you in so many directions with your character and just all kinds of things that, how you're standing, how you're sitting, how you're kneeling, all these things. But a good stage director also needs to see the whole picture. And in this case, Frank had this fantastic idea because there's a battle scene at the end of Rinaldo. And we really don't know how it was staged in Handel's day, but Frank brought in a troupe of tumblers, acrobats, to do the battle scene. It was really innovative and lots of fun. And I became friends with one of them, and every so often we see each other. Curly. He took the last splat on the last chord, but he also saved me one night when the boat that I was in malfunctioned. I knew that it was going to someday, and I said, this boat is definitely, it's not really well built. And so one night it just started to disintegrate while I was, going across the stage. And Curly held it up because he was a harpy in that act. And he held it up with one hand so that I was able to walk out of the boat. Then, of course, I had to go across the rest of the stage. And remember, I was in a boat, supposed to be riding on the water, so I just started to walk and went. One of the good laughs I've ever had in opera.
I thought you were going to say that a good stage director could help you walk on water,
Right.
but I suppose that.
Oh no, I think that somebody said, one of the fans said, she can even walk on water.
And Frank, from your perspective, Handel is tricky to stage, and at that point there was less even of a tradition than there is now. What were your thoughts about staging Handel, and how did you approach it? I believe that production began in 1975.
I was fascinated with the fact that at the time that Handel wrote, that the stars are not the composers, but the people who presented the productions and designed them, like Bernini. And in researching, found it, my God, extraordinary effects. That, usually when you see Baroque opera, everything's on point, you know what I mean? And nothing really happens. So I tried to get a designer who could do that, and we found one. But then he said, there's only one problem, that if you move the production, then you have to do it from scratch again. Oh, budget. So
You mean you would have to build the sets from scratch
yeah,
again?
completely, But however, what was important for the production, from my point of view, was that it was a stylized production in terms of the performances. But Marilyn did not mention the fact that with all of the choreography of it, these people who did it, these actors, these wonderful actors, it was also Sam Raimi's debut.
That's right.
Brought a kind of reality where you do not expect it to be in a Handel opera. And therefore, all the kneeling, all the ceremonies, there was some sense of the person behind it. And that's what is one of the extraordinary things about Marilyn, that she can execute any kind of a stylistic gesture or attitude, but it always has a sense of reality. And therefore, the fairy tale comes to life. And that troupe, yes, was an amazing troupe. They were, as a matter of fact, they had been champions. I found them, they were really
These are the tumblers.
They were really roughnecks. And in the greatest sense, they were not afraid of anything. And it was, I think, one of the most memorable moments I recall with one of those old medieval catapults with a long prong, and Marilyn strode out at the end of it, dangling at the end, and underneath these guys throwing each other around while she sang. I don't think that I've ever seen anything quite like that in Baroque opera, but that was the intention, the incredible kind of dramatic propulsion and imagination. I had never gotten over the fact that Bernini once designed a production, and that is what inspired me. which had row upon row upon, the usual Baroque outline of places, but usually made no use of. In one opera, a storm occurred in the back, and the water began to filter its way over each of the various barriers until it actually came toward the audience, at which point 3 huge stone walls came up out of the ground while women fainted in the audience. I mean, that was drama. You ever see that in a Baroque opera? I tried to get something like that. Couldn't do it, but in approaching it, I added the element of the work that I've done, and she is an extraordinary proponent, and not enough was made out of the fact that what was brought to it not only was that glorious voice, but the sense of a person, of who the hero is here. And all of them had that sense of believability, which is so important. I find that when it's missing in any opera, it shortchanges the composer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
you didn't mention, dear, that I was on that big catapult.
You were right at the edge.
Nothing to hang on to.
With nothing to
Way
hang on
over
to.
the orchestra pit.
Yes, and
The
she
stage
just stood
director.
there, stood her ground, while these...
And singing, go down, go down.
She was doing that while they were doing, usually, it's substituted by some very polite and decorous ballet.
Right.
And whenever you see, that's why, by the way, most Handel revivals are so boring. They do not get into that really wild mind that perpetrated these things. The wall of water that came down and up came the stones. I want to see that.
I'd love to see that. I'm waiting. Maestro Rudel, you can ask what I'm going to ask you next. The Julius Caesar production in 1966 has sort of gone down in history. It was Beverly Sills and Norman Treigle. It was also cut considerably. Many of the arias were cut, I believe, in an effort to bring across some dramatic immediacy to an audience that wasn't used to the kind of stasis of Handel opera.
There are 40 numbers in it, and most of them are arias.
40 numbers.
40 numbers, and each, the majority, the vast majority was I think, not meant for our modern ears and days. So we did make some cuts, but I think I hope they were judicious. And maybe today I wouldn't do it anymore.
I was going to ask.
It was new territory, and we didn't know how the reaction would be. So we were perhaps a little overcautious.
And the reaction was, I think, very favorable.
The reaction was very good.
What do you think about what's happened to Handel production now, particularly the City Opera, where it's become sort of a staple of the house, but internationally it's become very popular?
The more the merrier, I think.
Are you an advocate of original style? You were conducting a contemporary orchestra, a modern orchestra.
Well, to some degree, yes. I mean, we certainly try to do the ornamentations, at least try to simulate what might have happened some years before. But basically, I just asked, not only for the Baroque pieces, but for any piece. I had one dictum for any of the gentlemen of the stage director department. I said, do not betray the creators. In other words, you could be, and luckily both these gentlemen are of the same school, I think. They honor the intent, the original intent, and elaborate on it, and find new ways of saying it, but it's honorable.
And in the spirit of bringing across the meaning of pieces, Lotfi, I have once heard an opera administrator refer to supertitles as theatrical condoms. keeping the audience from the immediacy of what's happening and sheltering them. And I believe you probably had a lot of resistance when you were beginning with the idea of supertitles.
I have a long collection of what I've been called. Starting with, I remember one of our friends, colleagues, Mr. Martin Bernheimer, called it the plague from Canada. So,
I don't want to tell you what he called me at times.
so I think there was an enormous amount of resistance to it. They thought that I was vulgarizing it, and of course, I always felt the critics were all of a sudden a little bit threatened because they thought they were the ones who knew the story, and they didn't want the audience to know it, so they could write about it, you know. So, but anyway.
You know, Lotfi, when they really were getting started, my daughter, who had been plagued with having to come to opera since she was practically born, came to a performance of mine at the San Francisco Opera, and it was the first time she saw titles. And it was a Baroque opera, which are always so hard to follow anyway, and she came back, "Mom, super titles. It's the greatest thing that ever happened." You know, opera was getting, especially in the United States, it was always considered like an exotic art form, you know, very Eurocentric. And everybody was making fun of the stories of the operas. I mean, you know, if you want to use the Trovatore, I kept saying, "Which baby who got burned?" You know, all that. So, and it was only through all of a sudden you realized that you had fantastic libretti. I mean, you had Hofmannsthal, Boito, you know, all these wonderful, wonderful stories and characterizations and dramatic conflicts that when you didn't know any of that, it just was a muddle, you know. So I think that as a stage director, I was always frustrated because I would work very, very hard for hours on a kind of a small relationship between two characters, the motivations and the all that kind of stuff. The audience had no idea what the hell was going on. You know, so I think that was the motivation. May I ask a question?
Please.
Lotfi, was this something that you thought up, or did somebody come to you and say, "I have this wonderful invention"?
Well, you know, it's that story about the apple falling, you know. So because as my wife is not a great fan of Wagner. So we were watching the telecast of the centennial production of The Ring from Bayreuth. And of course on the telecast there's subtitles. And my wife we were watching it, and she looked at me, she says, "You know, Lotfi, this really is not as dumb as I thought it was." And so, because of all of a sudden you saw all of these wonderful characters, you know, the conflicts, you know, between Wotan and Brunhilde and all that stuff, and then that's where the lamp went, doing, you know. So I said, if they do that in cinema with foreign films, and television does it, why can't we do it in the theater? So that really was, so I always give the credit to my wife.
Well, forget about all your artistic triumphs.
No.
This is your epitaph.
I've already had it on my stone.
It's like the Kennedy Center Honors. That's how everybody's going to remember. Maestro Rudel, you put a great emphasis on stage directing as being part of the operatic experience and the dramatic experience. How did you come to invite Frank Corsaro to City Opera? What gave you that idea?
Susanna is the only opera that in 3 seasons had 3 different productions at City Opera, because it was brought in by Leinsdorf, who had a stage director named Leo Kurtz, who brought all the works that they did onto one stage, one idea of stage. It didn't work at all. When I took over, we had to start from scratch. We had to make a new set. So that was already double expense on a show. That was dangerous. And that didn't turn out very well. Not satisfying to Carlyle or to me. And so I decided we needed to do it again because we were going to take it to the Brussels World's Fair. That was going to be the American contribution. And so when we decided we had to do it again, I looked around as to who was doing interesting work in New York area. and came upon Frank Corsaro. So we had meetings, and he evidently knew music quite well. I was amazed and pleased. And so I invited him, and then we had a third production within 3 seasons of Susanna, a new production which really worked like a charm, and made, I think, helped establish Susanna as a main piece of repertory.
And Frank, what was your feeling? You loved opera growing up, I think, but had not worked in the field. What was your experience?
Well, I was a Saturday boy kid listening to the Met all the time. I was growing up. But I always wondered what was going on behind those beautiful voices, and I went finally to go to the Met. In order to do it, I joined the claque in order to get in, get a free ticket if you're willing to bravo the lady and the gentleman at a certain point. So I went in and discovered that, my God, they can act. They are marvelous singers, but they can't act.
They can't act.
No. I mean, I looked at them and I remembered, it really resembled what that English critic Newman said about acting on stage at that time. That if the leading lady raised her right hand, it meant something was afoot. But if she raised both hands, it signified a calamity. So anyway, when I took it on, I was very piqued because we had American actors singing. And I watched the production, and I was very intrigued, and I had a wonderful time from that point on. And he became one of the great, what he is, but he became one of the great impresarios because he followed through on a notion about American operas and American directors and gathered us together like rosebuds. And together we created a kind of special magic when particularly we moved over to Lincoln Center. And it has remained one of the most significant movements in American opera. That's partly why we're here today, We created a genuine profile, which is, well, I won't go on, but is missing still in opera. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're here, and God, many productions he and I did together. And he just asked me, how was Faust in Chicago? I said, it was still as good as ever. He had conducted it. And our favorite production, which I wrote, as I remember, is, oddly enough, Pelléas and Melisande, in which we, for years, tried to get revived. We have such special memories of it. But it was that. It was a kind of continuous, marvelous reciprocity, a generous exchange of talents among many directors. Lotfi was there among the colleagues. So I loved it. And I even actually, at one point after I did Susanna first time, thought, great, I went back to Broadway. And I realized Broadway was sort of falling apart. And one night I saw in the newspaper, last performance of Susanna, years later. I said, my God, I went back just to see what it was, and it was in wonderful shape. And that said to me, hey, this is somewhere to go back to. And I called Julius and I said, Julius, he said, where have you been? I remember. I said, oh, why? Come to my office. And he had Katerina Izmailova, which was the call.
And
then
Frank, of course, has been known to me in my field for many years. If he had never directed an opera, he would be a legend in the theater. Julius brought him in to do opera. Peter Gelb is doing that today, hiring theatrical directors, people with a theatrical sensibility. Opera obviously has dramatic content, yet it's still, to this day, controversial. And my question is, why? What's the dynamic there, and what's your feeling, Marilyn and Lotfi, about?
Oh, I've got big feelings about it.
Well, I'm very, as more of a layman, I'm curious.
I think exactly the thing that Lotfi said is so many of the stage directors now do not honor the composer. They're not in the spirit of what the opera really is. And too many things on the stage, just gratuitous cliches, let's mix neon in this production. Let's have the chorus walking slowly, slowly across the stage, out, and then back in again, slowly, slowly. And I mean, no.
Directorial showing off.
Absolutely. That's the problem, I think.
Well, the opera is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the greatest art forms ever created by human mind. It's a composite art form. The problem has been, I always use this as a couple of examples. I love to bring in, I had the great pleasure of having Frank direct productions, because someone like Frank, he not only comes from opera, but he appreciates and understands music. And of course, the opera is the combination of the music, and the music motivates the drama. When you get magnificent composers like Mozart, Verdi, Wagner, all that, But I know a lot of times they think it's very chic and elegant, and to being a stage director from theater. And then, I know one of my classic stories, in London, they got John Gielgud, brilliant Shakespearean actor, to direct the Don Giovanni at and so he was directing, and of course we all know that all the arias in Don Giovanni have very nice preludes. I mean, Donna Anna's got a beautiful back. And John was getting very nervous. And he just said, couldn't we just get on with it? Couldn't she just start singing? I mean, so the stage directors in opera must have that musical sensitivity. Every note of Mozart is a treasure. Every note has an emotional context. So I think what's wonderful with directors like Frank and others that they respect the art form, this combination of that. And the fact is they trust the creators. When you have these brilliant, brilliant creators like Verdi, excuse me, I mean, talk about humanity. You don't want to improve on him. You want to, you're going to put the best light on him to audience, because one of the greatest compliments for me as a stage director is always that the audience leaves the theater and says, my God, what a wonderful opera. What a wonderful piece. The minute for me they start noticing the stage director, I think there's something terribly wrong. The minute the stage director calls attention to himself, like says that, I'm much smarter.
By the way, that's also true in the theater itself.
Yeah.
When the stage director is saying, look at me and look at my concept and what I'm doing.
Exactly. And I'm sick of that, because, I'm not interested. I'm interested in the work. And when I want to tell the audience what a magnificent piece is Don Carlos or Tristan and all these things, not that for what Mansouri does with it. Who the hell gives a damn? I mean, it is the piece itself. And I think that's the problem nowadays, because they don't forget that what their function is to put, even if they want to put new lights on it, new nuances and all that, because those works are rich, very rich. And you can do it. I have no problem with that. But it's just that all of a sudden that the messenger is more important than the message.
But at some point, I think some of the productions that you did at City Opera were quite controversial, even done in that spirit. There's a time where audiences have trouble accepting something new.
Well, it was in a sense a beginning process. I believe that the kind of combination of my own work in Stanislavski and all of that, coming to opera, I thought no composer writes an opera that doesn't have some real meaning for himself. Whether it's fantasy or whatever, there's a real experience. So we began searching that out in the beginning ways. Sometimes I think at this point of history, I feel like Grandpa Moses, having sort of started that going. But what is happening now is that there has been a kind of surfeit of discovery there, and there is a need somehow or other to sort of upgrade the effect. These people who are directing are, many of them, very talented, but perversity and its friends seem to be a very important device for them to make it entertaining, to make it attractive. As if you're going to some kind of high class, I'm not kidding, some high class burlesque, and it often comes out as such. You know, and you also begin to feel that many of these people don't give a rap about opera. But, well, we'll show you. The Europeans particularly have that tired, worn-out feeling about it, and so they gussy it up, you know. But right now, I think we're going through a phase, only a phase, of that kind
I'd
of...
like...
I pray.
Yes,
I'd like to
it
pick
has
up-
to be, you know, it has to return, I'm not saying to a norm, but to a you know what's happened that's really horrible? Within whatever work we did, the spirit of the person, the spirit of the expression, the spirit of the composer was honored. Now you feel abandoned by that. You seem to be in some no-man land where there is literally almost no hope.
If I can go on a tangent from that as well, we've touched on the terrible stage or the evils of stage directing today, but we haven't touched on the evils of singing today.
The evil what?
The evils of singing today as the evils of stage directing. I know that many of the roles you sang are today sung by much lighter voices, and I know that you have a thing or two to say about vocal training today.
Well, sure. But I think, unfortunately, we can lay the problem at the staging, at the stage direction, because a singer doesn't know if they sign up for a production. Let's say a singer who's not well known. A singer who's well known is going to certainly delve in a little more. Who's going to be my conductor? Who's going to be my director? You know, they wouldn't dream probably of asking about this is the word of our time, concept of the opera, because they're looking for jobs, and they're looking for experience, right? But a singer doesn't know if her entrance is going to be coming in to sing her big aria hanging upside down from a trapeze, or God knows what else.
Or on a catapult.
Yeah, and
You
nudity,
just heard the word concept, dripping
nudity
with
and
contempt.
gratuitous sex and all of this stuff, which is so boring on the stage. And then you also have, one of my students recently told me a two-word phrase that I hadn't heard before. I said, "You're looking so great, you've lost so much weight, you just look fabulous." She said, "Well, you've got to be HD ready."
From the Met HD broadcast.
No, not just the Met.
Not
all
just the Met.
over. They're all
Right.
doing it now. So
Right.
it's all, you know, the tail's wagging the dog. I'm not quite sure, but I do think a lot of that is at fault. And then we have the horrible thing of electronics, you know.
You mean amplification?
Amplification. It's certainly, well, we don't have to say, you know, HD, of course, is electronic, no question. But that's the great leveler of voices that will even them out so that the weaker voices sound the same as the bigger voices. I'm not just talking about size either, but it's just a great equalizer. So what if we have that, what happens to great singing? I'm talking about great singing. It really gets shoved to the side. And that's my biggest fear right now, that great singing is maybe not savable, as we say. And I'm still teaching them how to sing, to get out over an orchestra, and you know all the ways that I was raised, and how I was taught, and actually how I hope I performed. But I hate it. I hate being 75 and saying I don't like this, I don't like that. I want to like it all. I hate to be. Oh, I'm just an old woman who's just, you know, grousing about how it used to be so much better. That's not true. I want it to be better.
Right.
But you know, when you have, say, athletics, every year we have these athletic meets, or every 4 years we have the Olympics. Records are being broken constantly. Things are better. They improve it. I don't know that singing's better. I really don't. But, yeah, I don't think so. Rossini said that great singing was already over when the castrati were out.
I found a quote from 1772 in which two people were bemoaning that singers today weren't at all like the old generation and the whole art was lost. Lotfi, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say, because one of the things that's going back a little bit at the genesis of the so-called concept regie, because I started my career in Europe. As you know yourself, you were in Germany for a while and all that. And, they have, in Germany alone, there were 88 opera companies, right? And when you're in those companies, there are a repertoire. And so you do a Traviata. And then 4 years later, you're doing a new Traviata. And so a new director certainly does not want to repeat what they did that. And so gradually, in Europe, then all of these kind of the Eurotrash style was invented because of this government subsidy that gives you the luxury of playing. That doesn't make a goddamn bit of difference if the houses are empty. But in the United States, if our houses, if under 85 or 90%, I think we're in trouble. And so that's the way it kind of started, of this type of thing. And then a lot of the younger directors, then they read about it. And also another fact, I hate to tell you this, because you've been from the press also helps it. Because if you do a very honest, direct production of Madame Butterfly, nobody gives a damn. And there really isn't much articles about that Madame Butterfly. But if you do a butterfly that at the end is an atomic bomb, and that explodes up, and the Nagasaki, blah, 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 all of that stuff, my God, every paper writes about it. So a young director is tempted to make a scandal. That's how he's going to make his name. So there are all these kind of factors. And so my only question is then, why the hell don't you then stimulate writing a new opera with your concept? Just leave Verdi, leave Puccini, leave all these old guys, what they have done. Create new pieces. And nowadays, for the United States. And we hope, with the government's help, and with subsidy, that we can do that. I think some of these problems could be addressed.
Well, your fellow honoree has at least written the Atom Bomb opera for
well, there you are.
John Adams'
there you
Dr.
are.
Atomic.
But still is music, and So I think it's a combination of things, and it's a kind of a opera in the United States right now is through a transition, and I see it as a very healthy transition, because it is growing, which is wonderful, which is growing. So, but I think that's the problem a little bit, because also we have to always remember we have to sell tickets. If we don't have the bums in the seats, we haven't got a season. Right. So if we scare them away, and also one of these avant-garde productions, once the novelty has wore off, you can't repeat it. Right. But everybody knocks Mr. Zeffirelli's Bohème. Excuse me, it's been running how long? But if all of a sudden you put in a La Bohème, let's say at the Chicago O'Hare Airport or in a men's urinal or whatever, and it's just, do you think you're going to go back second time and see that?
That's the problem also.
Once the novelties wore off, it's dead. But when it's true and it's really motivated by the creators and the music and the theater and all that, you can. Jean-Pierre Ponel, a brilliant, to this day, production that Ms. Horne has done, Italiana, is just as good today as it was when first you created it, because it's honest, it's fun, it's delicious, and it's correct. Yeah. Cenerentola, all of that.
That incredible Cenerentola.
Absolutely. So I think it is. We have to look at the totality of this.
Although at the same time, you're saying that we should write new operas, and I wanted to ask a final question from Maestro Rudel, and then open it up for a couple of questions from the audience. But what to you is the importance of the American opera tradition, and what were you looking for in new works, and what works do you think will survive?
Well, you look at all the factors. The music was the first, it's dramatic, in close proximity, and you determine what you hope or think is the value, and go by your instincts. it is true that I think 80% of success of a company is a question of the right repertory in the right combination. And that is sometimes it's luck, but most often it's long hours looking at many scores.
Well, if anybody has questions, we have time for a few questions from the room.
If you all could maybe cite one of the greatest moments of your careers. If that's possible.
Greatest moments of your careers.
A highlight that you
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Do we have time?
That should take up the Q&A period very nicely. Well, let me phrase the question to you, Ms. Horne. If you had to pick, given your involvement with contemporary opera, with all kinds of operas, many of your defining roles yet were the Rossini roles, the bel canto roles, is there one particular role of your heart that is something that you remember with particular fondness or allegiance?
Well, it might be Italiana. We did a production together, too, in Chicago. I remember, Lotfi, you put me up to doing something that time because we had a conductor. By the way, I was really very maligned and had a lot of trouble reintroducing the ornamentation and cadenzas to these operas that had been sterilized. And I think they were sterilized because the ornamentation and cadenzas and everything got to be too much. Right. Toscanini had a lot to do with that. But I had a conductor, and he was not buying any of the ornaments and the things that I had put in there. And so Lotfi put me up to this. He said, "Tell him you went to see a medium. And that you spoke to Rossini." So I did. And the conductor, he spoke like this, "Ma signora, non si può fare questo." And I remember I told him about the medium. I said, "Look, maestro, I went to a medium last night. I spoke to Rossini, and he said, 'Dai, Marilina, dai.'"
So you walk on water,
He
you commune with
almost
the dead.
believed me. He really looked at me with wide eyes, but I managed to, bring him around to my way of thinking, which, by the way, is totally the way it's all done now, too.
Absolutely.
But I had a lot of battles, especially with the Italiana. I had the same thing at La Scala, and I had sent all my ornaments in advance, just for the conductor to see them. What I liked to get was in the contract, black and white. But in that particular instance, it was my dear friend Claudio Abbado conducting, and we shared the same manager, Ronald Wilford, and he said, "Marilyn, I can't put that clause in there because Claudio, so we didn't get the clause." And there we were, right in it at the first rehearsal, and I remember I just decided that I had to ask everybody to leave because it was all the whole cast there for a sing-through. And I said, "I think we need to be alone, to go through this." And we had a pianist who was there who kept nodding every time that Claudia would say, "No, I don't like that." And, and I said, afterwards, I said, "Claudio, I sent these months ago to you," and I'm sure he never looked at them. And I said, "I'm not interested in doing it the other way." So I said, "Look, I'm going back to my hotel. I'll be happy to hear from anybody, but if I don't hear that it's okay, I'm leaving tomorrow morning, going back to New York." But that's when you can have a little clout in your life, right? And the young singers can't do that. They'll be fired on the spot, and they want to sing. They want to have a career. They want the whole thing. So that's when it's really hard. By the way, they did say okay. He did say okay.
I was going to say, they didn't let you fly back to New York.
Right. And then the critics came out, and this was, vendetta. Headlines. We've had Mozart up to now we've got Rossini.
Bringing it to the Italians.
But these were hard battles. But if you have a stage director like Lotfi who's inventive and says, tell him you saw a medium.
Well, very quickly, Maestro Rudel, do you have a highlight or a particular performance that you remember?
Well, there's one moment that was, to me, kind of awesome. I conducted Don Giovanni in the theater in which Mozart did the first performance in Prague. And to stand there where he stood was unbelievable. It could not be described.
Who was the stage director? Do you remember?
Forget it. It was totally unimaginative, but not original.
Lotfi, a moment.
Well, can I just say one of my memorable disasters? Because, you know, I've had wonderful violin. I mean, when you have people like Marilyn and Joan Sutherland singing together, and that's seventh heaven, I mean, all that. But I had just started my career in Zurich, and I got assigned to do a new production of Samson Delilah. And with wonderful James McCracken, and et cetera, and I was very proud. It was a grand opera and all that stuff. And I had a major baritone for the high priest. Well, in this particular performance, Jimmy did not sing. There was another tenor, an enormous, tall gentleman from Paris with a very teeny tiny voice. And so he was doing Samson and all that. So, but my best baritone, just that afternoon, got the telegram that the Metropolitan Opera had engaged him for some votons. So he started celebrating in the canteen in the afternoon. And he kept celebrating and celebrating. And so he got happier and happier during the whole and the production. Samson Delilah is not exactly the greatest work of music theater. And so by the time...
It was written as an oratorio. Give
exactly. But anyway, so we finally got the last act, and it's a big temple, and there's this, all the chorus singing, Dagon Soledad, blah, 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 blah. And Sandra Warfield was Delilah. And then I had staged it because the fire is a symbol of the Dagon, etc. And I had some kind of a powder that they would put it in this, and the flame would go up, and the chorus was the Dagon, and it's all very difficult. It's the soloist singers and the chorus singers and the orchestra comes in. Well, by the time we got to this point where the high priest and Delilah were putting the thing, our baritone found it very funny. So he would take the powder and go, Dagon. And then, of course, the chorus didn't get the cue. The conductor was, I don't think you might remember him, Sam Crackmalnick.
Sure.
Every four-letter word in Zurich was heard. And so this went, it got worse and worse and worse. And finally, of course, the stage manager lost his cue, didn't give the cue for the temple to fall. So Samson that night died of natural causes. So I will never forget that experience.
And neither will we. Frank, you didn't get your last word. Do you have a memorable experience to conclude?
Well, I still look back at Peleas as being something very special. As a matter of fact, I kind of jumped when I heard that Julius had given the opera to some other director, and I went after him. I said, I must do this work. He said, you want to do Peleas? For God's sake, why? So I explained a little bit of what I had in mind. He said, well, all right, we tried it. Anyway, it was a very, very terrific experience for me. And sort of the confirmation of it, in a way, came at one of the last performances of it, when we had a young man who was the son of Raoul Jobin, the great French tenor, and the father came to see that performance. And at the end of the performance, he said, you are the director? I said, yes. May I speak to you? I said, sure, what's he going to say? So he took me in the side. He said, what did you do to this opera? I said, what do you mean? You know, back in France, we look at it as a symbolic masterpiece. We don't think of it as an opera with people. We think of it as some kind of magical mysterious. I said, I see. She said, but I said, well, how did you feel about this? He said, I couldn't believe that it had that kind of dramatic life, that these were people. How did you do that? So I said, well, I directed it, I rehearsed it as if it were a very real piece. It's based on a real play. And what I did is I investigated as much as I could what the emotional problems were for all of these people. And I let them rip in rehearsal. And then I put a damper on it. So what do you mean a damper? Well, first of all, I put a scrim in front. Interestingly enough, I was trying to make use film at that time in relation to this piece. And I discovered in the early attempts with it that film doesn't really work in an opera other than in rather modern literature. Debussy is still in another era, and the rhythms of the opera were against what always happens when you show film. It forces a rhythm of its own. Anyway, I explained what I did, and I told them that I had them all at high point level, and the dampener was, I then gave each one a particular assignment so that you get the feeling of a long thread burning. And then little by little, in other words, it finally breaks. But even at the earliest, at beginnings of the opera, you sensed there was something emotionally very alive. And that accrued until finally the work broke out into a passionate statement that it is. And, you know, I believe all composers, you know, particularly Debussy with his... Debussy, by the way, Peleas and Berg's Wozzeck are really house clearers, had been. After the first act, everybody would leave. You know, what the hell are we listening to? What is this? Nobody's up there. It's some symbols. There's a bunch of Germans up there with, you know, Wozzeck. But our Peleas became a very definite success. People came to see a drama. And of course, the greatest moment and the funniest moment for me was at a performance which was reported by the New York Times. I don't know how the hell they got it, but there was a couple in the mezzanine looking at it. And at the end of the performance, when I came out as director, they had binoculars on. And this woman looked up and she looked at me and she said, man said, who are you looking at? I think that's Debussy on the stage. So he took the binoculars and said, let me look. Yep, that's Debussy.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on, with the house clearer. Thank you all so much for taking part in the
Thanks,
discussion.
Anne.
Thank you all for coming.